Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday to you. Welcome to some stops along the way where we're going to continue our deep dive into Afghanistan today. But first, I want to show you my Eskimo Joe's t shirt. I'm rocking the shirt today. Eskimo Joe's, Stillwater, Oklahoma, home of Oklahoma State University. If you ever get the chance to go to Stillwater, make sure and go by and see Stan Clark and our friends at Eskimo Joe's. And that is a non paid advertisement for EJ's just because I like it and I like their clothing line. Anyway, moving on to other more important things this morning, jumping back into Afghanistan. How do I encapsulate my time in Afghanistan, especially those early years? As I told you in the last episode, I was in Afghanistan almost 4 years. And I think one of the best ways I can describe it is surreal. A few years ago, Debbie and I were watching television and we came across on the streaming service this movie Whiskey Tango Foxtrot by Tina Fey. And it was about Afghanistan. So we decided to watch it. And it is poignant in some ways, absurd in other ways, funny in other ways. But there are some scenes in that movie that were so much like Afghanistan. It was unbelievable. In fact, at some point in the movie, I think they refer to the term kabubble. And that's the term that those of us that lived in and worked in Afghanistan used for the experience of being there. It's like we were in a bubble, and we were in Kabul, so thus the kabubble. It was almost like a parallel universe. And when you left that to go back to the world, as we called it, go back to decent society, it was like you were leaving that bubble and going back to reality. But while you were in that bubble, it's like nothing made sense. You couldn't get to from A to Z. Some people manifested this thought of the kabubble by doing absurd things that they would never do in polite society. You know, drinking to excess, having affairs, partying like crazy. I knew many expatriates that did that just to numb the stress of being there. I didn't do that. I worked. I threw myself into work. And that was one of many approaches to dealing with this strange conglomeration of events that happened virtually every day in what we called the kabubble. When I first went to Afghanistan and moved out of the Intercontinental Hotel and into a compound that we had leased in Wazir Akbar Khan, which is one part of the city. It was the compound that we leased was actually very close to the one where Taliban leader Mullah Omar had lived. Of course, his compound had been heavily bombed and was in ruins. But we were just down the street from there. And I remember those first few nights. I was the only expat there. We had guards on the outside of the compound. We had one inside. But those first few nights were very stressful because there was gunfire, there was all types of noises going on around the city to remind you of where you were and remind you that violence was all around you. And combine that with being homesick, and it was a tough thing to bear. So I tell people today that I got through those early days and really got my equilibrium in Afghanistan because of three people. My wife, Debbie, was first and most important because there were many nights when I would lay in bed with gunfire and explosions going on around the city and call Debbie and talk to her until I went to sleep. She could tell you today that there were many times when we were talking and she'd say, "Mark, are you still there?" And she could hear me breathe and realize I finally gone to sleep and my phone was there in the bed with me. She talked me off the ledge so many times while I was there and reminded me that it was God's will that I was there and that I had a job to do and that I'd made a commitment to do it. So without her, I would have jumped back on a plane and gone home. Two other people that were really important. Bruce Springsteen was one of them. You're going to think that's funny, but I would sit after work in that compound at night with all this going on around me and lights going on and off because our generator was only partially working in those early days, and sometimes it was darkness. And that generator would only light 2 or 3 bulbs. So I would hope that my laptop battery would hold out long enough for me to play the Bruce Springsteen Live in Barcelona DVD. And I would put on headphones to block out the noise, and I would listen and watch Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band sing My City of Ruin, Waiting on a Sunny Day, Badlands, Thunder Road. And that was a connection to home, and it calmed me. A third person that helped me through those early days was Meatloaf. Not the kind that you eat, but the singer. Again, I would put on my headphones and I would listen to Bat Out of Hell and 2 Out of 3 Ain't Bad and Paradise by the Dashboard Light and close my eyes and go to another place. It really helped me through a time when I didn't know if I was going to be able to remain in Afghanistan. It helped me get over the hump. And that first winter in Afghanistan didn't help because I arrived in 2003. By the time I moved into in October of 2003, by the time I moved into the compound, it was November. It started getting cold. It gets very cold in Afghanistan in general. And in Kabul, it's in a bowl. It's surrounded by mountains. And so the cold will come in and it'll stay. And if snow comes in, it'll come in and typically swirl around the city and stay for a length of time. And our generator was only partially working at the time. We had no hot water whatsoever. A little bit of electricity. It was cold. It was cold all the time. You couldn't get warm. I would sit at my desk in a suit and an overcoat and take off my gloves long enough to type emails or to do reports and put my gloves back on. And that was inside. Outside, the cold was just bone chilling. It would drill into you and make you just freeze from the inside out. I remember our cook, Mohammed, would run water in the sink and then he would boil it and he would put it in the bathtub and we'd let it sit for a while until I could bear it, and that's the only way to get a hot bath was when he boiled the water. It was brutal in that first winter. But there were a lot of good times as well. A lot of milestones that made me realize why I was there and that the work that we were doing and that we were going to do was significant. One of those was Election Day on April 5th, 2004. This was the first presidential election post-Taliban. Afghanistan had a history of elections before. Some people say it was the first election in Afghanistan. That's incorrect. It was the first presidential election post-Taliban and the first democratic election in many, many, many years. Now, the fact that the election was somewhat tainted, probably corrupt, was one thing. But the act of seeing people go out in the streets and vote for an elected leader, in this case, the winner was the interim president, or the president that had been installed in December 2001 as the representative or the leader of the interim governing council of Afghanistan until elections could be held, Hamid Karzai. So he was head of that council, and then he won the election in 2004. But on election day, several of us were election observers. And so I went out with some of our team members to different polling areas around the city and took some amazing photographs. One I'll never forget is that there were so many women in blue burqas lined up outside of this polling station that the guards that were protecting the polling station actually got nervous and were trying to block the door. And the look on this guy's face, just seeing this mass of blue burqas coming at him, wanting to vote, was amazing. It's unbelievable. And people holding up their thumbs where they put them in ink because many of them couldn't read or write. And so they would put their thumbprint in ink by the name of the person when it was read to them. It was a happy day to see people take control of their own governance. Now, of course, we learned somewhat later that the election, there were a lot of anomalies in that election. There were a lot of payoffs. There were a lot of things that were wrong about that election that Hamid Karzai won. But it was a milestone event that showed that there was progress being made. It was an amazing time. And the longer I stayed there in those early days, the more convinced I became that we could do some good. And the more comfortable I became with my environment. The U.S. government required us to, every 3 months or so, to leave the country for a short period of time to decompress for R&R. I went to different places during my time there for R&R. Sometimes I would meet Debbie somewhere in the world. Other times I would go myself. But whenever I left Afghanistan, I learned to have at least 2 airline tickets in my pocket for different airlines. Sometimes I flew UNHAS, United Nations Humanitarian Air Service. They were usually pretty consistent. Sometimes an airline called CAM Air, which was a private airline that had a little bit of a sketchy arrival departure rating. And then there was the hapless Ariana Afghan Airlines, which at that time was just a hopeless mess. But the reason you had more than one ticket is that the flights were canceled so many times that you had to prepare. If you went with just one ticket, you might be going back to your compound and not going anywhere. So you learn to prepare. And the airline tickets to Dubai were not that expensive, or to Delhi or to Islamabad, wherever you were going on R&R. They weren't that expensive. So you learn to have more than one ticket. This really helped me that first Christmas that I was coming home from Afghanistan for just a short Christmas break. It had been snowing for days and days. They were canceling flights like crazy. So it was a little break in the snow right before Christmas. And so I went to the airport with my 2 airline tickets in my pocket. A friend of mine that worked for another organization was also there, and he had a ticket on Ariana Afghan Airlines, which was a mistake in its own right. And so I checked in for Ariana as well because it was leaving first, and walked back with my ticket. And delay. No announcement. No one knew why the flight wasn't going. And my friend was getting more and more agitated. So finally, I realized that this is not going to happen. And so I went back to the front of the airport, which was very easy because it was a small, decrepit airport. Told the guy, I want to go on Comair. And I transferred to Comair, which was leaving about an hour and a half later. Went back, and sure enough, in a few minutes, they start loading the Comair flight. And I get up to go. And my friend says, "Where are you going?" They didn't call Ariana. And I said, "Oh, dude, I have a ticket on Comair as well. I'm out of here." And as I was walking out to the airplane to board, I looked back and my friend is standing at the window, and I won't tell you what gesture he was giving me from the window, but he was not very happy. But he learned a lesson that day, as I had previously. Always show up with 2 airline tickets. It helped me out in another instance as well, when I was out at the airport waiting on an Ariana flight, and it's not going. Finally, I knew the director of Ariana Afghan Airlines, who was an Afghan American guy who lived in Kabul, and I called him and said, "What is the problem with this flight?" And because the Comair flight had been canceled as well, so this was my only option. Even though I had 2 tickets, it was my only option. And he said, "I'll get back with you." A few minutes later, he calls me and says, "Mark, look, the flight is going to go. It's just a little bit delayed because they oversold business class. And they didn't know what to do to fix it. So I told them what to do. They're going to fix it. They'll get going." So in just a few moments, I see 2 workers run out to the plane with electric drills. And I hear the bzz, 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 because the plane was literally right outside of the terminal. They come off with 2 business class seats. They go into the hangar. They come out with 3 economy class seats. And I hear this bzz, 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 bzz. They get off the plane. Immediately they call boarding. I step on the plane, and in the aisle is a 3rd seat in business class. You could barely get down the aisle of the airplane because of this seat. And so some hapless person had to sit in the middle of the aisle in business class for the entire flight to Dubai. But I think he was just glad to get gone. These are the kind of absurd things that happen. And that's why air travel from Kabul was crazy the entire time I was there, but especially in those early days. I've been asked a lot of times too, what were the highs and lows of your time there? Well, there were a number of them, but one of the highs was definitely our project's creation of the Afghan Women's Business Association that I mentioned in the first episode. An association, the first one in Afghanistan, that the women's governed themselves. And they made crafts, and they made some money, and they invested that money in other women, and there were training programs. And they were so happy to have that kind of independence, because when they left that building and went to their homes, it was a much different scenario, because women were treated very poorly in Afghanistan. But when they were in there together, they could make decisions. They could do things that were meaningful. And it empowered them so much. And that was a real high point for me. The low point was the night that Debbie called and told me about my brother's death. I was standing in my compound after work. Debbie calls and tells me that James, my eldest brother, has passed away after a very brief but debilitating battle with cancer. I felt absolutely helpless. I got off the phone with Debbie, didn't know what to do. So I called one of my best friends there, a guy named Greg, who ran a project for another company. Told him what had happened. And within a few minutes, he had mobilized his leadership team, and they came over to the compound because they didn't want me to be alone. And then other friends had heard, and they started showing up. And pretty soon we had 15 or 20 people in the compound. And we were eating kebabs and enjoying each other's company because they were willing to go through the danger of leaving their compound to make sure I wasn't alone that night. So yes, that was a really low point for me, but it was also one where I saw who my true friends really were. There were other happy times as well, a lot of them. But one of them early on was that it had snowed for days, a lot of snow on the ground. And we're sitting in our office, and by that time we had several people on staff. And the Afghans were very diligent at their work, and in most cases, in most companies, they had to work very hard. There wasn't a lot of laughter. There wasn't a lot of frivolous activity. They had to buckle down and work. But I wanted people to work hard, but also to have fun at what they were doing. And so there's a little break in the snow, even though there was a lot on the ground. And so I walked in the office. I got everybody together, said, everybody stop working. Follow me. Put your coats on. Follow me. And we went outside, and for the next hour and a half, built snowmen, had a snowball fight, and otherwise just decompressed. And I'll never forget the laughter as that Afghan team ran around in the yard throwing snowballs and building a snowman. And our expatriate program director, Christina, was out there with them. And she was helping build a snowman. They built a snowman and a snow woman. And in the snow woman, they put a cover over her head to denote the culture. It was a fun and interesting day. And we did things like that periodically just to alleviate the stress. So those early days were challenging. They were long. Sometimes they were really hot in the summer. They were cold in the winter. They could almost be debilitating at times. But they were also hopeful. And there was a lot of laughter along with a lot of tears. And that really cemented in me a desire to help the people of Afghanistan, to take what they were investing in their own blood and turn it into something that would change their lives for the better. And during that time, my team and I had to interact with a lot of different stakeholders to do the work that we were doing. And I want to talk about some of them today because this was a time prior to the April 2004 election, there was a caretaker government, an interim government that was led by Hamid Karzai and a council. And it was trying to lay the foundation for enhanced civil society in the country. Even after the election, though, the real power in Afghanistan was not in the national government. It was not controlled by Hamid Karzai or the Afghan army. It was controlled by the warlords. The warlords who controlled vast areas of the country and who had their own militias, and who Karzai and the national government had to placate in order to ensure that the country didn't devolve into chaos, because there had been civil war so many times. When they weren't fighting a foreign army, they were fighting each other. And so we had to interact with a lot of these warlords in order to do our work. I want to introduce you to a few of them. One of them, who, and I mentioned him in our last episode, was Abdullah Rashid Dostum, the Uzbek warlord in Mazar-e-Sharif, which is in the north part of Afghanistan. Dostum was a former governor of Mazar-e-Sharif. He was a former Mujahideen commander. The interesting thing about Dostum is that, unlike many of the other warlords and unlike many in the national government, he was more liberal and somewhat leftist in his leanings. For instance, when he was in control in Mazar-e-Sharif, he allowed girls to go to school. He liked to watch Indian movies. In fact, he said one time that we will not submit to any government where there is no whiskey and music. That was the kind of guy that he was. He was certainly not the conservative ilk of the Taliban, and that's why he really despised the Taliban. And in 2001, when just prior to the American coalition invading Afghanistan, the United States sent advisors, Green Beret advisors, to Afghanistan to work with Dostum and others to weaken the Taliban's position. If you've seen the movie 12 Strong, it talks about this time. And the individual who plays Dostum in that movie looks just like him. It's a scary resemblance. Because quite frankly, he's a pretty scary guy. There was an attempt on his life in 2019, and he fled Mazar-e-Sharif in 2021 when the American coalition had left and the Taliban regained its foothold in the country, and he now lives in Turkey. My interaction with Dostum spanned 2 or 3 different occasions. I have a photo in my office of Dostum and I sitting on a couch in Mazar-e-Sharif the first time that I met him. And he was very cordial. He allowed us to do everything that we needed to do to help his people. But just the look in his eyes was scary. He had the eyes of a killer. And regardless of what you think of him as a person, that had been a lot of his life, had been fighting. And so he had that quote-unquote killer instinct. I met him also later on, again in Mazar-e-Sharif, and really saw the kind of power that he wielded in that area. His word was the absolute law. It didn't matter what Hamid Karzai and the national government were saying. In that area, Abdullah Rashid Dostum's word was the law. Another warlord that I interacted with was Ismail Khan, who's a Tajik warlord from Herat, which is in the west part of the country. Again, he was a former Mujahideen commander, former governor of Herat. When I was there, he became Minister of Energy because the Karzai government, in order to placate the warlords, had to really hand out positions to a lot of the warlords. And I really appreciated the fact that Ismail Khan became Minister of Energy because he moved onto my street. And that's the first time that we had non-generator electricity probably ever, is when the new Minister of Energy moved onto our street. Ismail Khan was an imposing figure, long white beard. He usually was wearing long white robes. I interacted with him a few times in Kabul, but also in Herat. Again, he was all powerful. His word in that area was literally the law of the land. Another warlord who had been assassinated prior to my arriving in Afghanistan, but we have to talk about him because of the importance that he played in that period of Afghanistan's history. And that's Ahmad Shah Massoud, who's a Tajik warlord from the Panjshir Valley. Massoud, they called him the Great Massoud. He was a guerrilla commander. He was assassinated on September 9th, 2011 by two Tunisians who were disguised as a film crew. He was a fighter. He commanded fierce loyalty by his army, and he was salient in helping the Northern Alliance organize against the Taliban. And prior to that, in the fight against the Russians, and then in the Civil War. Great Massoud is a revered figure in Afghanistan even today. And his assassination was really a touch point for many Afghans to turn on the Taliban and want to install a new government. And just a few months later, after the Twin Towers came down and the attacks on the Pentagon and the crash in Pennsylvania, with the help of the Americans and other allies, the Northern Alliance, even after Massoud's death, was able to drive the Taliban out of power. We also had to deal with a lot of politicians, and I won't cover all of them because there's no way I could do that. But I do want to tell you about a few of them. And the first one is probably less a politician than a religious leader, but he was he was the leader and founder and leader of the Taliban from 1994 to 2013. His name's Mullah Omar. He's Pashtun, and he was, by all accounts, a very perplexing and somewhat strange leader. Reclusive, but very dogmatic in the way he approached Islam. He and the Taliban did bring order to society after the Civil War. And as I said in the first episode, the people welcomed that for a while. But then Mullah Omar and the Taliban began to take this strict interpretation of Islam that debilitated the country. So when he was dislodged as the leader, when the Taliban fled the American-led coalition in 2001, he went into hiding. He was protected by those around him. And actually the United States and other coalition partners, as much as they looked for him, they never caught up with him. He died of tuberculosis in 2013, still in hiding. But one of the things that became almost synonymous with Mullah Omar and the Taliban was the destruction of the ancient Buddha statues in Bamyan in 2001. I've seen the statues were gone by the time I got to Afghanistan, but I went to Bamyan on several occasions and we saw where the statues used to be. the holes in the mountain where they used to be. And it was so unbelievable that a ruler would have blown up those ancient statues that were part of their history. And I think Mullah Omar's quote as to why he authorized that is really telling. He said, "I did not want to destroy the Bamyan Buddhas. In fact, some foreigners came to me and said they would like to conduct repair work of the Buddhas that had been slightly damaged due to rains. This shocked me. I thought these callous people have no regard for thousands of living human beings, the Afghans who are dying of hunger, but they're so concerned about non-living objects like the Buddha. This was extremely deplorable to me. That's why I ordered their destruction. Had they come for humanitarian work, I would have never ordered the Buddha's destruction." Well, he was right in some way that Afghans were living in deplorable conditions. Even when I got to Afghanistan and went to Bamyan, on the mountainside, the hillside where the Buddhas had been, there were many caves, and people were living in those caves because it's the only housing that they had. At night, it looked like the hills had eyes because of the cooking fires that you could see in the caves. People were living in horrifying conditions. But to use that, which quite frankly, many of those conditions had been caused by the Taliban's dogmatic view of the world itself, to use that as a reason to blow up a significant part of Afghan history tells a lot about Mullah Omar and the Taliban. Another interesting thing about Mullah Omar, though, was he was very anti-poppy, anti-opium. He believed it was an affront to Islam. And he actually banned the growth of poppy. And in Taliban-controlled areas from 1999 through 2001, 1999 is when he instituted this ban, until he was deposed in 2001, there was a 99% reduction in the growth of poppy, which therefore constricted the opium, the creation of opium and the heroin trade. Now, some could argue that made the price of heroin go up, and so the Afghan warlords and politicians who were involved in that probably made an even more obscene amount of money than ordinary. But the fact is that they went in, they burned the poppy crops, they had done something that others had never done, and that is reduce the hectares of land that were devoted to poppy. The interesting attachment to this is that more than 3 million Afghans were involved in opium production. And after Mullah Omar was ousted as the leader and the Taliban were gone, the coalition forces and the caretaker government were in place, the United States spent $7.8 billion during those years in counter-narcotics efforts. And other countries did the same. They had an alternative livelihoods program, which I described in the last episode, to encourage farmers to grow other crops than opium. And yet opium production rose during that period by more than 200,000 acres. Because of the reasons I explained in the last episode. Too many people were making money. The farmers had no control. They were not making the money themselves. They were forced to grow this crop. And so all this money spent, $7.8 billion, actually led to an increase, not a decrease, in opium production. Our intentions were good. But the Afghan culture was something different. And the only way to really reduce opium production is the way that Mullah Omar did it. And that is by use of force. Which, of course, the American coalition would not do and the international community would not do. They appealed to the goodwill of the warlords, the goodwill of the politicians, who, many of whom were making so much money that they were not going to respond to this at all. Interesting point about Mullah Omar. So there's some good with the bad, but the fact is that he and the Taliban created ruinous circumstances for Afghanistan and were enemies not just of the United States, but of the world. Then there's Hamid Karzai from Kandahar. His family was very powerful around Kandahar. Karzai is an interesting individual. He initially supported the Taliban, but later had a falling out with them, and his father was actually assassinated by the Taliban. From 2000 to 2001, Karzai, who was increasing in importance now because he was head of his family, gathered support for the Northern Alliance to fight against the Taliban. Once the Taliban were dislodged, he became interim chairman of the governing council in December 2001, the de facto transitional president of Afghanistan. And then he ran for the presidency in 2004 and won. And again in 2009 and won. So he was president from 2004 to 2012. Hamid Karzai was supported by the American and international coalitions, and yet it's widely perceived that he played both sides. He brought people into his government that were, at least the feeling was, they were patently corrupt, tied to the drug trade. His cabinet was littered with all types of sundry individuals, such as warlords. And the reason for this was that he had to create stability in the country. And so he had to bring the people into the government who could create that sustainability, or that stability rather, even if they were not the kind of individuals that you would want to associate with in decent society. I was never a big Hamid Karzai fan, but he was the person at that time that was helping drive forward the movement toward democracy in Afghanistan. He was almost assassinated several times. As a matter of fact, the first time that he was almost assassinated was right before I came to Afghanistan, and his American bodyguards actually shot the person who had saved him from being assassinated. They shot him by mistake. But life was cheap in Afghanistan, and certainly if you were a politician there and anti-Taliban at the time that the insurgency was happening, your life was at stake. In 2014, Ashraf Ghani Ahmadzai, a Pashtun, was elected president. He was a former World Bank executive. He was former Minister of Finance from 2002 to 2004. That's for part of the period I was there. Then for the latter part of the period I was there, from 2004 to 2008, he was president of Kabul University. He's an academic, very brilliant man. And he became president, as I said, in 2014, and he served through 2021. In 2014, several candidates emerged for the presidency, but two really were the front runners, if you will. That is Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah Abdullah. I'll talk about Abdullah Abdullah in a few moments. But one could see, and I had the strong belief, I was not an Ashraf Ghani fan either, but one could see the direction that the country was going. He was cobbling together. When he became president, he had to do something with Abdullah, so he gave him a senior position in government, even though they couldn't stand each other. And he did the same thing Karzai did. He brought in various and sundry warlords and nefarious people into government. Whether or not that government was corrupt, it's not for me to say, because I don't have any firsthand knowledge of it. But certainly the perception was that that government was weak and potentially corrupt. The warlords still controlled large swaths of the country. And in 2021, when the United States coalition was withdrawn from Afghanistan in very short order, he had to make the decision. Ashraf Ghani had to make the decision, do I go or do I stay? And of course, he did exactly what I anticipated he would do, is that he ran like a rat off a sinking ship. And later, when he was out of the country, he tried to, in various and sundry ways, justify why he left instead of staying and fighting. And one of the things he said was this. He said, the reason I left was because I did not want to give the Taliban and their supporters the pleasure of yet again humiliating an Afghan president and making him sign over legitimacy of the government. I've never been afraid. You've seen repeatedly rockets have landed around me and I've not moved. And it was a split-second decision because they'd entered Kabul and the U.S. Embassy had already been evacuated. In my mind, he can put any spin on it that he wants. He ran like a rat. Fast forward to 2022, the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. President Zelensky of Ukraine had the same decision to make. Do I stay or do I go? His response was very different. When he made the statement, I don't need transportation out of the country, I need ammunition to fight the Russians. Not so with Ashraf Ghani. When the Taliban were coming into Kabul, he was headed to the exit. And he lives in exile to this day. The person who ran against him, and who was another very powerful political figure at that time, was Abdullah. He ran against Ashraf Ghani both in 2014 and in 2019. He was the Afghan foreign minister from 2001 to 2005. And the Secretary General of the Massoud Foundation since 2005. And both of the times that he ran for president, it was very contentious, very chaotic. Observers during that time said the elections were very corrupt, ballot stuffing, buying votes. But Abdullah lost both times. He accepted the defeat in 2014 in exchange for a senior post in government. But in 2019, he actually contested it, and he installed himself as president on the same day that Ashraf Ghani, who was the ultimate winner of the election, installed himself. So you basically had two people on the same day that were taking the oath of office for president of Afghanistan. Of course, a deal was brokered by the international community that once again made Ashraf Ghani president and gave Abdullah a senior role in government. But this is he personified the type of Afghan politician that was, you never really knew which side they were on. Let's just say it that way. Another politician I interacted with on several occasions, who was a Tajik, was Ahmad Zia Massoud, the brother of the great Massoud, Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Zia Massoud was ambassador to Afghanistan to the Russian Federation from 2001 to 2004, and he was first vice president of Afghanistan from 2004 to 2009. He never really had the gravitas of his brother, but the Massoud name meant so much that it was important to be attached to government, which is why Hamid Karzai brought him in as first vice president during his time there because it solidified a Tajik power base and a lot of the population of Afghanistan in support of his government. The last political figure I'll talk about that I worked with when I was there is Syed Mustafa Kazemi, who was Transitional Minister of Commerce. I worked with him a great number of times. And while he was tantamount to a warlord, he became one of the most credible, I believe, political figures in Afghanistan. After he was Minister of Commerce, he became a member of the opposition, a member of parliament. He had a way about him that drew people to him, and he loved his country. He loved his people. He wanted, in his core, to do the right thing. I believe that he was going to run for president. I believe that if he had run for president in either 2009 or 14 or 19, that there's a good chance that he would have won. But that didn't happen. Because shortly after I left Afghanistan in July of 2007, the following, I believe it was in October, Syed Mustafa Kazemi was assassinated. And not even the Taliban were willing to take credit for that, by the way. So it's still a mystery to this day who was actually responsible. A lot of people have their opinions of who was responsible. But on that day, it erased one, in my mind, one of the most credible political figures in the country. One of my treasured photos from Afghanistan include myself standing with Minister Kazemi. First time I met him, we sat outside of a compound in the middle of nowhere and ate rice together. And even then, before I really knew him, I believed that he was a person who, despite his past, despite all the wars and the things that he had to do and the approach that he had taken to life, he was a person who really wanted to do the best thing for his country. And had he got the chance to do that, I think Afghanistan's recent history might be much different. So those were some of the important warlords and political characters that we dealt with during my time there. But the most important people that I dealt with on a daily basis were our staff members. They weren't wealthy. They weren't powerful. They didn't come from big families, elite families. They were just normal Afghans who came to work and work hard and loved their country and loved what we were doing and were passionate about it and really became a source of strength and confidence to myself, to my deputy there, first Richard Kramer and later on Tim Bisbee, and to Christina, our project manager. We could not have accomplished what we accomplished in Afghanistan without these staff members. I already told you in the first episode about Basmala and Noor. But there are so many others. Mohammed, our cook, who is the best kebab cook in Kabul, probably in Afghanistan. There were so many of my expat friends who tried to steal Mohammed. We made sure we paid him well so he would stay with us. He was just a great guy. Cooked 3 meals a day for our team. And then anytime we had people over the compound, he loved to cook for a lot of people. He'd cook kebabs, and I can taste them to this day. They would melt in your mouth. And then there was Riza, who started as our inside guard. The first time that I noticed Riza after we hired him as a guard, he was sitting inside the compound in the freezing cold. reading a dilapidated English book. The cover literally had fallen off of it. And it was a basic English book where he was trying desperately to learn the English language. And I thought, look, if he could sit out here in the cold as a guard who doesn't make much money at all and try to learn English, there's something about him that we can use. And Riza became our office manager later on. He did such a good job. I saw him grow so much in the time that I was there. He was an amazing young man, and now he has his own family. He's a businessman. He's doing extremely well for himself. Then we had a young man named Omaid we hired as a project assistant. Omaid had boundless energy, and he loved the work that we were doing, and he was creative, he was talented, he was intelligent, he was all the things that you want in a project manager. And today, Omaid has made an international name for himself through an organization called Warlords, which he founded. He's an artist. And after the Taliban were dislodged, Omaid founded an organization that painted peace murals all around the city, which now have been destroyed when the Taliban came back. But he's received funding from foundations all over the world and now travels the world promoting peace through art. And his career started with us right there in Kabul, a young man who channeled his energy and passion into something now that has a global scale. The first young lady we hired on our project, her name was Sawa. And her father actually came down and interviewed me before he would allow her to come to work for us. She was an amazing project manager. I had the chance to attend her wedding while I was there. Her smile would light up a room. She was intelligent. She spoke English well. She was literally the kind of person that you would want to be on your team. And even our cleaner, Mrs. Nikidar, funniest lady in the world. She'd never seen a vacuum sweeper before, so when we bought her a vacuum so that she could vacuum the floors in both our office and our house, it was bigger than she was. It had hoses running from it, and I remember her coming down the stairs one day with the hoses wrapped around her, trying to pull this thing down the stairs. And all I could think of was, who you going to call? Dustbuster. I mean, just an amazing, amazing woman who lived a very, very difficult life, but who always had that smile. She would always put big horse blankets on my bed in the wintertime where I could hardly move when I went to bed, but she wanted to make sure that I was warm. She was an amazing lady. Then I worked with some amazing expatriates there as well. I already talked about my two deputies. The first being Richard Kramer, and the second being Tim Bisbee. And I'll talk more about both of them in future episodes. So, that's a little bit about how we got started in Afghanistan, and some of the people that we interacted with, and a little bit of a context of the polarizing figures that were in place at that time. In the next episode, we're really going to talk about the work itself, what we were able to do there, the legacy of that work, and a little bit about the geopolitical context in which Afghanistan found itself in then and now. Until then, I'm Mark McCord. This is Some Stops Along the Way. Really glad you joined us, and we'll see you next Monday.